Hey guys, Kevin here. So tonight I thought I would deviate from my normal material design in XAML and instead favor going through and stepping back and showing you guys sort of basics of WPF C Sharp development and usually how I go about starting to create an app. So there's certainly going to be material design that gets pulled in because it's one of my favorite theme libraries and I think it's awesome. But we may pull in some other third-party libraries as well and just try to see what it takes to build an app and kind of go through the basics of what I think is sort of important for WPF. I want to say this too. There is, I guess, a minor expectation I have that most people watching this sort of have some level of knowledge of C Sharp. If you're just starting out, great, welcome. Please ask lots of questions. I don't mind deviating and answering them, but at least just in the normal flow that I tend to go through, I usually assume some amount of knowledge of C Sharp. So if you're coming from a different language, you're just starting out programming, you're interested in trying to figure out what is this, hopefully this will give you sort of a good starting base of where we're looking to go. So to that end, let's jump over here real quick and we will dive in. So I am going to be using Visual Studio 2019, latest and greatest stuff. I don't think there's anything I'm planning on showing that is necessarily specific to this. I am running Enterprise, but the Community Edition works just as well. So when you first fire up Visual Studio 2019, you're probably going to be greeted with a screen similar to this. Probably not with a full list of projects, but in our case, we're just going to create a new project. So in our case, what we're looking for is WPF app .NET framework. Now, if you've got the newer .NET 5 or .NET Core 3.0, as it's also being called, you may see this version down here. For now, I'm just going to be targeting framework, but the new .NET Core stuff is the latest and greatest and forthcoming very soon. So, but we're at least going to start with .NET Framework, and then hopefully in a few months we'll probably revisit this app and see about porting it over to .NET Core and what that actually takes. So we're going to start there. So I think we're going to call this simply budget. I've for a long time wanted to build out a very simple budgeting application just to keep things easy for me. So this is going to be sort of a look and an experiment to that regard. Plus budgeting I think is a fairly simple and straightforward concept. Dollars come in, dollars go out, and ultimately for your money you need to track it in some way. So we are going to do this. I tend to put all of my projects in C:\dev. Wherever you like to put them is great. And I'm going to target .NET 4.7.2 just to be on the latest and greatest. And create new project. Now it's worth knowing with WPF, when you start reading a lot of tutorials, there's a lot of conflicting information out on the internet. You'll run into a lot of people who will very much push the model view model or MVVM pattern, and some people are very strict adherents to it, and you must do MVVM for everything. I tend to agree. I think WPF was very much designed with an MVVM architecture in mind, but that is not the only way to build an app. To some degrees, it actually makes the app harder to build depending on what you're actually trying to do. So I'll show briefly what it looks like to build it without the MVVM pattern, but hopefully by the end of this I've convinced you that that's probably the way that you want to go. It does add a little bit more to the learning curve, so on top of learning WPF, XAML, you add a design pattern into the mix that just makes the learning on top of it a little harder. So when you fire up here, you end up with a new window class. The window is the root object in all WPF applications, or I should say root. It is the root display object that you see. So in Windows, such as Visual Studio here, this big box around here is your window, and everything you put inside of it is your content. So in this case, our window has nothing. It has a single element inside of it called a grid, and the grid doesn't have anything inside of that. So let's just put a little button with some content on the button, if I can spell correctly. And in the proud history of programmers everywhere, we will start with hello world. Okay. If we take our app, fire it up, we should get a button with hello world. For those of you who are watching and worried that this seems very basic, don't worry. I tend to move fast and we will quickly accelerate to the fun stuff. Especially as I get more caffeine in me. Feed that Mountain Dew addiction just a little bit more. For those people who are interested, I do run an extension in Visual Studio called ReSharper. I find that it makes my life a little easier. It also does tend to slow down Visual Studio significantly. So our window started up. We have a button. As you can see, as I put my cursor over the button in Windows, the default view in at least Windows 10 is it gets highlighted with this nice blue color, and as you can see, the button is filling the entire contents. So as I resize the window, the button just automatically fills. By default in WPF, typically you can assume that most controls are going to fill the available space that you give them. In this case, we gave the button an entire grid, and we gave the grid an entire window to work with. So they're all just filling up everything. Okay. So now, taking a look, if we wanted to, a button has a click event, and we could go ahead and generate a click event handler. For reference, if you're wondering, the button that I'm using to automatically generate the code is control period. So we could generate a click event handler, and then we could do something inside of this handler, which is fine. And this is ultimately right where the deviation between MVVM and normal apps deviate, is this code file right here. So you'll notice our main window.xaml has a main window.xaml.c# file right underneath it. And if you don't use the MVVM design pattern, you usually end up writing a decent amount of code inside of this code behind file, as it's typically referred to. And inside of this file, you do things like handle your button clicks, or if you need to update your elements to say change our button's text, you might do that here. So let's give our button a name so that we can reference it. Give it a more specific name. So in WPF, if you give something a name using the x:name attribute, it generates a field in your code behind inside of this initialized component that you can then use. Let's see if we can look at it real quick. I don't know if it's going to decompile without it there. So we have my button that I can now reference, and we could change the content to, other content, right? And we fire this app up here, and when we click our button's content is going to change. Just like that. Great, it works. And we could continue building out our app this way, where we add elements to our XAML file and then respond to various events such as button clicks or the user pressing a keyboard shortcut, etc. And we could do stuff. And the big problem with this is it leaves a big gap in unit testing, which we'll get to in a minute. And it also means that you're very much in charge of manually managing all of the state. So if you need to, say, disable a bunch of controls, you're in charge of doing that. There's no sort of automatic, hey, I flip a switch and say, now I'm in editing mode, and so everything goes into editing mode. There's not necessarily an easy way to do that. Now, you can write the code. That's a nice helper method that says, oh, when I, say, turn all my controls into editing mode, it goes and toggles all of the state on everything and handles that for me. But now you've got a mix between your XAML file here and your code behind here all managing state. And it sort of gets to be a little challenging. Now for simple apps, that might be great. And I've seen very large complex apps built without MVVM and built exactly this way. And they work. But they do tend to lack in unit tests. They tend to be a little bit more buggy. And overall a little bit more difficult to follow. So let's, with that in mind, let's start looking at what it takes to change this. So First thing we're going to do is let's replace this button click handler and do something different. So we are going to create a new class, public class main window view model, right? Okay, and it will have public string content, and this is just a normal auto property. And let's create a constructor for this guy, and we'll say when we first start, our content will be hello world. Okay. The next thing we need to do is actually set up this view model so that our view can use it. So let's define a couple terms real quick. So view model means an object that provides data for the view. Okay, I've seen a lot of kind of complicated definitions of MVVM. Ultimately, when it boils down to it, the view model object just provides data for the view. Simple enough. So we need to set it somewhere that the view can access it. So in WPF, the data context property is how you do that. So when we create our main window, we are going to just create a new instance of our view model and set it as the data context. Okay, simple and straightforward. So now up here, we have the ability to access that view model object and apply the content right here. So, and I'm going to just dock this guy on the side. You know what? I'm realizing my font is probably a little small, so let's fix that real quick too while we're in here. Tools, be big. There, thank you. Okay, so we've got our view model object here and our view over here. Just knock you down. The way that the MVVM pattern works is you have a view and a view model, and there needs to be some amount of glue that lets you link those two things together. And in this case, it's referred to as a binding. So we're just going to dump this guy into a nested element. And so inside of this content, rather than just directly putting text, we're going to create a binding. We're going to give it a path, and that path is going to be to the content property. Okay. Now if we fire this guy back up, we're going to see that rather than the text that we just set there, we end up getting the same thing of hello world, which is set currently only in our content property. Okay, and if we click it, it still changes. So real quick, just showing off that again. So we had, rather than specifying the content like this of hello world, we specify it with a binding. The binding looks into the data context objects for a property called content and simply calls the getter for this property to read it out and put it as the content of this button. So normally when you set content, it just displays that directly, but in this case, if it sees a binding, it knows to use the binding to say provide me that value instead, so that we can set it as our content property. Okay, but we still have two things going on here. We still have an X name and a button click handler. So again, I realize I'm skimming over some details, and if people would like more in-depth discussion on any of this, please let me know. But to replace this out, the MVVM pattern instead uses what's called commands. So public I command change content, right? Okay, so just a quick comment on naming. Some people will suffix this with the name command. I usually don't. That's just me. But a command is a way of a way for the view model to respond when something in the view happens. So in this case, the button object has a command property. And so we can tell it to use this command instead. So we simply do binding path change content. And so this will now link up this command property to this button. So when the button is clicked, it will invoke this command. Now, the first problem that we're going to run into is even though this nice iCommand interface exists, WPF does not provide us with a default command implementation, which is somewhat frustrating. So there is a blog post that I've written sort of diving in deeper on all of this stuff. I will grab the link and throw it in chat real quick if people want to dive deeper. But for our purposes here tonight, we are going to switch and actually just bring in a third-party library. Because I find it's, rather than recreating these things, it is much easier to start with something that somebody else has already created. So let's see. Here is the blog post for anyone interested. And if anyone's just interested, there's the short link to a list of all of my blogs for anybody who just wants a cheat or jump in here. So currently we have no NuGet packages installed. We are going to go and grab one of my favorites. So there are lots of WPF frameworks that exist out there. And I'm not really interested in comparing and contrasting all of them. I say pick the one that works best for you. And in my case, that is MVVM Lite. As the name implies, it is a lightweight library. Now, specifically, I am looking for not the root level library, but I like even less than that. So there's like the MVVM Lite libs is the base level library that has basically just the C# classes that we need to get started. And you can use this in Xamarin Forms, UWP, WPF. It's pretty agnostic as far as which platform you're looking to target. And it has what I would argue are the essential pieces for doing MVVM that are lacking. Oh, you downloaded and I didn't tell you to grab the latest. So what needs an update? Common locator? Sure, you can update. We're going to use the latest stuff on everything. Great. I don't know if we're actually even going to make use of the service locator in this guy. Okay. So here we need to actually create up a command. And in MVVM Lite, there are, so let's see, change content, gets new. There are 2 relay commands. So there is, and which one did it grab? So there is one that lives in Galasoft, sorry for anybody who knows this, or Galasoft, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. Galasoft MVVM Lite command WPF, and there's one that lives in command. So in our case, without going into the details, you probably want, if you're unsure, you want the one that lives underneath command WPF. For those people who are looking for a little bit more of an explanation, the difference comes with how the can execute changed event gets raised for these. If you use the regular one, you're responsible for always doing it. If you use this one, I'll just show you real quick. Let's see, command WPF, sure. This guy here, if you use the WPF one, it uses the command manager for when to requery. Yeah, so it registers up on the static requery suggested from the WPF command manager, which is the subtle difference between them. So a relay command takes in a simple method, so on change content, and then we will auto-generate the method. As a naming standard that I adhere to, this is not based on anything else, I tend to make my execute methods on command name, just because it makes sense and it makes it very easy to find out. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to then change our content to other content. And then at this point, what we're going to do is we're just going to actually, just to make sure that we don't cheat, we're going to comment out that click handler and we're going to remove the X name as well. So for those people who are interested in seeing it, stick around for a minute. Comment those out and move them outside of the tag because they have to be down lower. And let's just flatten this up so that it's a little more obvious what's going on here. Okay, fire this guy up, see what happens. Okay, hello world, and I'm going to put a breakpoint right here just to prove that we invoke it. So we click, we hit our breakpoint inside of our relay command. So because the buttons command is bound, we call our execute method, which is onChangeContent. It's going to change our content property. We can see that that is now other content. We hit F5, and our button hasn't changed. Now, the reason for this is because of the way bindings work. Bindings will provide a value initially. So when this data context was set on the window and this binding was initially evaluated, it got the value of hello world, which is great. That's where we expected it to start. However, we need something to tell the binding that this property has changed and now something else, and now it has a new value. So in WPF land, it is, or I guess not WPF land, in MVVM land, it is the iNotify property changed interface. Okay, and no. And the iNotify property changed interface has a single event on it called property changed. What this binding object does is it looks for objects that implement this interface, and if it sees that, it will register for this event. If this event gets raised with the property name of content, it will then go back through and reread this property. So we are just going to take our new onPropertyChanged method, call onPropertyChanged, use the new C# name of, and we'll tell it that the property name is going to be content. So this will now invoke the event, or I should say raise the event by invoking it, and it will create a new property changed event args with this property name. Okay. So now we will back up and take a quick peek at this. So when we click, this now shows other content because the binding was now told to properly update. Okay. Now, this is certainly more code than this. However, this has a very large advantage. This is something that I can unit test. This is not. This is hard. Because this lives on a GUI object, there's all kinds of dependencies that make unit testing this type of logic difficult. Now, it's certainly possible to write code where this click event calls out to some other method and you unit test that other method, and that works great. But this sort of forces everything into a nice common pattern. So, since I've been talking about this the whole time, let's actually go through and start looking at doing this unit testing. So, I know some people don't necessarily enjoy unit testing. However, I subscribe to the idea of test-driven development, which says that you should write your tests, verify that your tests fail, and then modify your code so that the test then passes and work forward from there. And I would say about 90% of the time, that works best. So in our case, and I will just search, so MS test. Again, there are lots of unit testing projects out there. Why do I not see, I only see MS test project core. I do not see, why do I not, oh boy, I know I should have unit testing projects installed. So let's just search testing real quick and see, because I thought I had unit test. So it's called unit test project, not MS test project. Perfect. So because we're a .NET Framework app, I'm going to use a .NET Framework unit testing project. And so budget tests, And once again, I'm going to target the same framework just for my own sanity, because if you target different frameworks, your life will get complicated fast. Okay, so let's start with this. So it generated us a default unit test class, and I'm just going to move this guy onto this side over here so we can keep track of him. And we are going to bring this guy across. Assuming I can do this. I am going to start by renaming this to just be main window view model test. Okay, so at least my naming scheme on this project is going to be the class that's being tested suffixed with test. Okay, so we'll write our first test method. Change content sets content to other content. Okay. There is another unit testing design pattern that I also like a lot called the arrange act assert pattern. You'll see people just call it AAA. And a lot of times I will put in these comments just to keep me focused. So in the arrange portion, we do any precondition setup that is needed for our unit test. So in this case, we just need a view model. So main window view model. And we do not have a reference set up to that yet. So let's come over here to our Solution Explorer. We'll right click on references and add a reference. So this is in our unit test project. And we are going to add a reference to our main project. Okay, so now this guy goes away. Great. As part of our act, we do the one interaction which is expected to be tested. So in this case, what we are asserting is that our act is the change content command is executed, and it doesn't take any parameters. So we pass null, and then we will assert that, let's see, our view model's content property should be other content, right? And then we will go over to our test explorer here, and we'll just run all tests for the moment while it figures out what tests there are. Apparently I missed the button when it loaded. There is some pretty cool updates coming for Visual Studio 19 with the unit test runner. So keep an eye out for updates for that in the near future. There's some pretty cool stuff with the grouping and running. And so people who have really liked the ReSharper unit test runner, you will be very happy with this. So we have a passing unit test. Hooray! Which is what we were going for. So let's start to make this a little more complicated, because ultimately this is what we were looking to build out. So I'm going to do a couple things real quick, just for refactoring and keeping things organized. So in my WPF projects, I usually start by adding in a couple namespaces. So I usually do a view, and I usually do a view model namespace. Okay, I'm going to move my window into my view. Yeah, no, trust me, it will not take a long time to move a single file. And then I always update my windows, or I should say all of my classes, so that their namespaces match. So we are going to change this into the Simply Budget View namespace. It's worth noting, so ReSharper did a little magic to help me out here. So when it added the .view to the namespace here, over in the XAML, it also updated this X class attribute so that it has both, so that it includes view.mainWindow. These do need to line up, otherwise your XAML won't necessarily know which code behind file to grab. Okay, we're going to take our view model class, and we are going to move it out because it does not belong in the view namespace. So we're going to refactor it into its own file, And then we're going to take this view model and just bring it over here. Again, some of the refactoring toys that are happening here are coming from ReSharper, not just default Visual Studio. So the Simply Budget view namespace is going to switch over and become a view model namespace. And we're just I'm going to start cleaning this code up so we can start sort of moving faster. That blog post that I linked earlier regarding the MVVM Getting Started document, I go into a little bit more depth on doing the MVVM pattern with iNotifyPropertyChanged and iCommand and how all of that works. So if you're wanting to dive in more, I recommend that as well. Okay, so where are we at? We have a WPF project with a view namespace and a view model namespace. And now let's go through and build this out. So rather than just working with content and commands, which this is fine, there is a simpler way to go about doing this. So in MVVM Lite, they provide a class called a view model base. And a lot of MVVM projects provide a very similar object. This object down here implements the property changed event for us. So let's just look real quick at what is now on our base class. So we have a set method, a raise property changed method, which is very similar to the to this method that ReSharper auto generated for us. So rather than calling it on property changed, it is just raise property changed, because that's effectively all this method does, is raise the event. But we can go through and clean up all of this logic. And so it would be equivalent to this, but this is problematic. Having to go through and set a property and then raise an event every time it changes gets really old really fast and takes a lot of effort. So instead, what we can do is we can actually bundle all of this logic up inside of the property. So we're going to update this to a property with a backing field. Okay? And our getter is fine. We just need to return the value. But our setter needs to do something a little more advanced. So let's break this guy up a little bit. So the first thing we're going to do is verify if our content is different from our value. And again, this is just about trying to make the MVVM pattern simple and easy to use. Okay? So we're going to first check if the value is not equal to the current value. And if it's not equal, then we'll go ahead and set our current field to the value. And then we will call raise property changed with the name of our content, right? And this is the general pattern that you want to follow always when building up view model properties that are going to be bound. Okay? I've seen a lot of times where people omit this if statement, like this. And this technically works. Your app will run. The problem is if you have a lot of set calls where this value is equal, and it may not always be obvious that you have set calls where this value is equal, you can easily get yourself into infinite loops and just general slowdown performance. Because calling this raise property changed and raising that event, that's expensive. All of the bindings that you have on your view have to look at that event to determine if it's even intended for it. So there's a bunch of event handlers that all have to be processed. And then any of them where it matches, then they have to go and do the work of getting the new value off of that property and setting it. So you want to avoid raising the property changed method as much as possible. Now, if this property has legitimately changed, then yeah, you should do it, but only if it's changed. Now, this whole logic, this is a very common repeated pattern. And so MVVM Lite offers us a simple set method where we can simply pass a reference to our field and then pass the new value that's coming in. And this, let's see, bool did change, right? So this set method is identical to this logic. It'll check the values to see if they're different, and if they're different, it will set the value and raise the event for us so that we don't have to do anything magical. And so then if we had some logic where we wanted to do some additional work inside of the setter, we could do it here, but again, we'd want to check this Boolean to make sure that we really did change the property. We don't want to do unnecessary work if this setter is just coming in. Because remember, you have the setters that are here, but you also have bindings that could trigger a set operation as well. So it's not always just the setters that you see here, but it's also the setters that come from your view as well that could trigger a set. Okay? So in general, only do extra work if the property is actually changed. Only raise the iNotify property changed event if you actually get a new value. Okay? So what you will see me do is most of the time when I'm writing properties, they'll end up looking something like this, where I've got a single backing field, my getter just returns it, and my setter calls the set method. That way I know that I'm not doing extra work, and then if I need to daisy chain some stuff together, we can. Okay, back to fun. So this is all well and good, but let's look at doing something a little different. It is worth pointing out, especially since I was mentioning unit testing earlier, that in general, I do not unit test my UI. Or I should say, I do not unit test my UI directly. So this is still somewhat difficult to unit test. You can do UI tests against it using something like Selenium or Appium. But it's not necessarily something that gets unit tested. What I do is unit test my view model and assume that if my view model is functioning correctly, my view probably is as well. Okay. The other big thing to note is your view model shouldn't contain view elements. So for example, if I had something like public button submit button, right? This is bad. View models should typically never reference view objects, because once you start referencing view objects in your view model, you now start eliminating one of the big draws of the MVVM pattern, namely unit testability. So if you start putting view objects in here, you'll start to notice that your unit testing gets more difficult, and therefore it kind of defeats one of the main purposes behind doing it. And so I question why you're doing MVVM if you need your view objects back here. So if you find yourself doing this, stop. There's better ways to go about doing it. Okay? So let's go through here. So let's change this guy up. So on our grid, we are going to create just a couple rows, I think. So grid, row definitions, row definition, and we will have this thing be height of 1 star, and then we will do a row definition with a height of auto. Okay, so in a grid, it contains both row definitions and column definitions. Because we haven't specified any column definitions, it has one column that fills the whole thing. But it now has 2 rows. One row that's going to automatically be as tall as the content, and then one row that's going to fill up the rest of the space. 1 star is just a weight. If there were 2 of these, we would then have these 2 rows would be of equal height of the remaining space left over after this one. I tend to use a lot of grids because I think they're the easiest way to get kind of complex layouts done quickly. But there are several other kind of panel layout type objects in WPF. So we're going to go down here and we are going to put a grid row 1, and we'll move this guy up. And so our button has now been pushed into the second row. And let's go through, and right here, let's do a list box and grid row 0. So the row 0 is not strictly necessary. It'll default to 0 if I don't specify anything, but sometimes it's nice to be explicit. And then let's do an item source. So this is one of those areas where MVVM really starts to make your life a lot easier. You can use listbox directly if you want, and you can go directly and add items to it and manually manage that. It gets hard. A much better option is to set up an item source and bind it to a list. So in our case, just like we have the iNotify property changed interface to notify bindings when properties changed, there is also a iNotify collection changed, which notifies a binding when an item in a list has changed. So what we are going to create is observable collection, and for now we're just going to do let's create a new class real quick. Public class transaction, right? And maybe we'll just make this description. So simple object, it's just going to have a description property on it. So we are going to make this a list of transactions. Okay. And get, right? And let's just automatically initialize this guy to a new observable collection. In general, I do find myself using this pattern a lot, where for the collections that I use are just automatically initialized auto properties, so they're effectively they're read-only, and all I'm going to ever do is modify this collection. Okay. In fact, I might even go as far as to just make this an iList, just so that I don't get too fancy on anything that I'm doing. Okay. And then let's change up this change content to add transaction, right? So this guy here, let's change there on add transaction. So I trust we don't necessarily need these guys directly anymore. We're going to just bounce this guy back a little bit. So content add, oh, not what I told you to do. Thank you for trying to be helpful, not what I told you to do. So simple button. I also like self-closing my tags when possible because it saves me one extra line. Okay, so we'll clean up this guy here. This becomes on transaction. And in here, what we're going to do is we're just going to go var new transaction. Okay, we'll set a description. We'll get transaction, and we'll just, well, let's do string interpolation here. Let's see, transactions.count. And then we will just add in a new one. Transactions, add new transaction, right? So when this command is invoked, we're going to create a new transaction object, add it to our list. In this case, our list is an observable collection, so it will notify WPF that there is a new item in the list. And we will go ahead and bind that to our transactions. Okay, so this is getting annoying, so we're going to fix this real quick. So right now, you'll notice when I'm typing in here, and I do, path equals, no IntelliSense. So there is a way to actually tell WPF or the XAML designer for this what the view model type is, because it doesn't know what type we're going to set into our data context property. As far as it's concerned, it's just a raw object. So what you can set is the d:\data context property. And you'll notice the d:; is actually marked as something that's being ignored right now. It says don't actually compile this data, just use it for design time, hence the d. So it's only going to be used as part of this designer. So we can do curly brace, d:; design instance. We can set its type to be main window view model. We'll bring that in. So you will notice that ReSharper auto-coded and completed this namespace for it. So you will need an XML namespace pointed at our view models namespace. And so we tell it that the design instance, so the design time instance for this binding, is a main window view model. Now you'll notice it immediately noticed that, hey, this change content command doesn't exist. So we'll go through and change that to add transaction. And you'll notice now we're getting IntelliSense on our view model. Again, it doesn't prevent errors, but it certainly helps you spot them quickly. So we will bind ourselves to our transactions. Now, the next thing we need to do is actually display our transactions in our list box. Now, there are things like display member path, where we could point this at description. And so it would be a list of all of the items in the description, and that would work. But the display member path is really only good for simple situations where there's just one property that you want to display. In our case, and what I find in most cases, is I actually have much more complex items. Even if there's maybe one bit of text to display, I usually want some sort of icon or something else to go along with that. So what we can do is we can do what's called a data template for this. So we will just do this right in line. Come on. So list box, and it's called item template is the property for it. So the item template on the list box takes in a data template, and we will tell it that the data type of this is going to be a transaction. Okay? And I just want to double check because I always get confused whether it's the style or the data template where this is an object, not an actual data type. This one is an object. So this, even though this is what it auto-completed to, the data type property here is technically an arbitrary object. So this data type will just be this literal string because it doesn't know to convert it to a type object. So in our case, we want to do x:type and then make sure that it knows that, no, this really is this type of object. The other thing that this does is, once again, it will give us, so text block, text, binding, description. So you'll notice we now actually get nice IntelliSense by setting our data type on our template. So for now, our data template is going to simply be a single element of text block with our description in it. For reference, in WPF there are two kind of main controls for displaying text. There is text block and label. For people who are coming from a Windows Forms background, label may seem a little more intuitive. There is a subtle difference between them. There is a text block is just your lightweight, I need to display some text. Labels have a little bit more heavyweight for things like accessibility text. So unless you need those extra features that come with label, just use text block everywhere. And we have a couple compilers to deal with. So it looks like some of them are in the unit tests, and we got to do a couple things. So first of all, we need to add some manage NuGet packages, and I did it at the solution level rather than at the project, because this guy here needs to be added into our unit tests because we are referencing a view model. And so it needs to know about its base classes, which the base class for our view model lives here. So we are going to just accept that, bring that in, great. So that'll fix a couple of the errors where it was unhappy about that. The next problem is this is going to be, our unit test is now completely wrong. So add transaction, execute. So let's change this name. Add transaction adds a new transaction. And if I was following test-driven development, I would have written this test prior, but oops. So we will do view model transactions let's just do a count. So this guy here, assert are equal that there is a new item in our list. Okay. We could also add asserts on the description property as well, but we're going to be changing that later, so we'll add those when we get to it. So let's compile and make sure this works. Now it's happy. Cannot locate resource main window.xaml. So you'll recall that we moved our main window into the view namespace, and then we changed its namespace. When a WPF app starts, inside of the app.xaml, it has a, boy, I am struggling to grab a hold of that. It has a startup URI as part of this. So because we moved it, we need to update this to actually reference our main window inside of our views namespace, so it knows which one to grab. Let's try that again real quick. See if that fires up and works a little bit better. So there's that. It actually starts. If we click add, transaction 0, add. Okay. And now we have sort of the basics of actually getting this app up and running. So let's go through and let's keep going. So because I also promised that this would include material design stuff, so let's go ahead and look at what that is. Because right now, our app looks like a default WPF app. It's not real pretty. So this is a fairly simple process as well. So we will go on our WPF project, add NuGet reference. We will go to browse and type in material design themes. We're going to grab this guy up here. And in this case, I'm feeling brave, and I'm going to just grab the latest pre-release, which is 260 CI build 1577. So we'll just grab that guy and bring him in real quick. Go ahead and download, install, add package. Okay, and before we get going with this, there's one thing that we need to do first. So in our application resources, we need a resource dictionary. Okay, resource dictionaries are, as the name implies, just dictionaries that pull this stuff. Just saw a comment. Sorry, Tillman. Yo, I'd learned Xamarin instead. Already compiles down to WPF, has material design, and you can make the app cross-platform. You are correct. The only drawback with it, because I assume what you're referring to is Xamarin Forms as well. The Xamarin Forms uses platform renderers to get it to be effectively cross-platform, and doesn't necessarily expose all of the WPF stuff. Yes, I am aware that you can dive down to custom renderers, but some of this theming stuff that we're about to do doesn't quite work. But if somebody is interested in trying to get as many platforms as possible, Xamarin Forms is an excellent suggestion. Before they canceled the certification, I was a Xamarin certified mobile developer. So if people are interested in some Xamarin streams, I'm happy to do that. I started doing WPF instead, largely because people like James Montemagno already have quite a few Xamarin Form streams out there. Oh, nice. Yeah, I was actually supposed to go to the Xamarin Dev Summit and ended up having a scheduling conflict and wasn't able to attend, which was very disappointing for me. But yeah, it is a wonderful platform, and there are plenty of guys out there. I am blanking on his first name. Clancy also has a really great Xamarin Forms stream, and then David, oh boy, Ortineu, I'm probably butchering his last name. I apologize, David. Are also That name right there. Thank you, Tillman. They all have really great Xamarin Form streams out on Twitch. So I would very much recommend subscribing to all three of those guys. They do some really good work. And it's usually good. I try to jump on their streams when I have time. Unfortunately, time is a precious commodity. So, and I lost track of where I was. Material design and WPF resources. So we installed the material design themes NuGet package, but we actually now need to pick which theme that we want to do. So in the 2.6.0 release, there is a new theming API that's available. So if you are pulling in the latest stable release, which as of today is 2.5.1, this will not work. You do need the preview packages for this to work. So we will just take one of the bundled themes and pull this in. So once again, you do need an XML namespace referencing material design in XAML, WinFX XAML themes. So you'll notice it pre-populated mine to be material design. And then the bundled theme has a couple choices. So there's a base theme. So in our case, I think I'm going to go dark theme because dark theme is awesome. We'll do a primary color of, I don't know, let's do like deep purple and a secondary color of lime. This somewhat matches the other one. Secondary color, why is it unhappy with me? Oh, did my NuGet package not go out? Oh, that's fun. So I might not have the latest NuGet package that I think. So let's just do manage NuGet packages real quick and see what all is installed here. Because if you just have the you will need the updated material design colors library as well. You cannot just grab the default. There is a breaking issue on some of the CI builds for the 2.6.0 release. So you want the latest 1.2.0 build. And that should make it a little less unhappy with me. So let's close that out and go back to this. There we go. Secondary color, lime. Now it's happier. Okay, so this will give us a nice bundled theme and bring all of those in. And the last thing we need to do is actually leverage some of these colors. So in the material design library, there is no style for window. So if you want to apply styles to your window, which I think is probably a good idea, we are just going to create an implicit style, target type, window, and there's nothing really to base it on. So we're going to set a couple colors here. So setter, property, background, value. How was the Xamarin Dev Summit, Tillman? If you don't mind me kind of diverting and doing two things at once. So I am going to jump over here real quick to my GitHub, and we'll just show you where to grab these resource keys from. So on the material design library, which for anybody following along, there's the link there. There is a demo app, and under the demo app there is a main window. And so the properties that you're looking for, and this is also, if you look at the Getting Started guide on the wiki, this is also in there as well. But the key properties that you're looking for are these ones right through here. So if you want to pick up the Roboto font, the background, the text color, all of those, these are ultimately the properties you're looking to set. So we are just going to, let's see, setter background is material design paper. So we'll just drop that guy in there. And then setter on the property, text element, foreground, value, dynamic resource, and then we're just going to pick up the material design body brush. So this will just propagate our colors onto our window as well. Okay, let's fire this up and take a look at it. Oh, and my window did not pick up any of my themes or my colors. What? Oh, because I forgot to apply any of them. Okay. So the other step that I completely spaced on, and again, this is also in the Getting Started guide on the wiki as well. In your XAML, you do need to also include this resource dictionary as well. So when you do the merge dictionaries, we need to not only bring in the colors, but we also need to bring in the default themes for each of the controls. So this defaults resource dictionary has styles similar to this that are set up. They're called implicit styles, so they'll get automatically applied to any control that matches the target type. And this is what actually has most of the material design stuff on it. And so the one other thing I want to do real quick, just to make sure our style on our window is working. Oh, let's getting too many tabs going. Eventually have to declare tab bankruptcy and just throw it in. Let's just close some of this stuff for a moment. So I'm just going to put a little bit of a margin, if I can spell, on my grid just to bring everything in just a little bit. Okay, so let's fire this guy up and see where this lands us. Because hopefully this way it'll make sure that we are exposing our window background all the way through. Okay, so that's better. You'll notice our button now picks up, and I've lost my list view, and okay, that's exciting. My background color didn't get applied. Oh, that's right, because you cannot do an implicit window style like this. So X key window style. So we're just going to give this a reference, and then we'll bring it in over here. Style, static resource, window style. And then let's relaunch, and that should at least bring in the color themes, and then we'll figure out what happened to my list box. I think what happened is the items are actually there, but because we picked the dark theme, the text is white. There it is. Okay, that's what I thought. So because we picked the dark theme, the text color was getting set, but the background was not. And so it was flowing through. So now we've got some nice, a little bit better looking app. It's still a default list box with just a button to add stuff to it, but we're making progress. So if we wanted to create transactions, we could bring those in. Okay, let's keep running forward and see how far we get on this. For those people who are interested in following along, I did create an empty repository that I plan on pushing this work to. So if people want to jump in and do stuff or see the code and follow along, that's where it will be. Okay, so let's start looking at doing some more stuff with this. So on the list box, we might want to actually go through and delete stuff, for example, right? So the list box contains some input bindings, and so we will do a key binding. We will say bind up the delete key to a command again, and we are going to bind this to the remove transaction. And you'll notice this is key right here. Is the UI is determining what actions are actually going to invoke these commands. Our view model doesn't know about that, nor should it. The view model's job is just to expose the data that the view needs. So in this case, it knows that it needs to expose a remove transaction command. So we're going to just stub this out real quick, and then we'll actually do this the appropriate way. So we'll create another command. So rather than add, we will do remove transaction, right? That goes there, that goes there, and then let's jump over to our unit test project. Because once again, I find test-driven development saves time in the long run. Because if all of my unit tests pass, I have a high degree of confidence that my app is going to work exactly as I expect, and therefore I have less churn of start the app, click through a bunch of things, verify it works, that kind of thing. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to write a couple tests real quick. So remove transaction removes the selected transaction, right? Okay. So over here we are going to invoke remove transaction, execute, but one of the things that we need to do is we need to actually add some items to our transactions list, right? Because we need something there to actually verify that it goes away. So var transaction1 gets new transaction there. Description, I'm going to put something in here so that it works. And 2 transaction 2, right? So because we want to verify that it removes the one that we expect, and so we'll verify that it removes transaction 1, and then we'll add transaction 2. And then on our remove transaction, we're going to actually feed it the value of transaction 1. Okay, so once again, our assert on the count is fine, but then I believe I want to actually make sure that it removes the correct one. So we will do transaction 2 should be the only item in this collection. So our count check is no longer necessary. So the single method will throw an exception if there is more or less than one item, which is exactly what we're looking for. So we no longer need the assert equals 1 there. So we will verify that just this one works, and then let's run our tests. And like good test-driven development or good test-driven development developers, we should have the tests go red and then green. Okay, let's just get rid of that banner. Go ahead, compile. For those people who are interested, especially if you have access to Visual Studio, I think it requires Enterprise. There is a feature called Live Unit Testing. You can also get it with third-party tools like nCrunch. It is wonderful. It basically can run your unit test while you're sitting here. My poor little machine while streaming can't handle it. So I'm manually running the unit tests when we need them. But if you have access to one of those tools, I recommend you turn it on. They are very handy. Okay, so now we need to actually implement our remove transaction command. So this guy is failing currently because it's throwing a no ref because we have not actually set up the command at all. So let's do that. So come on. Why are you not letting me type? You just don't want to let me, okay. We're going to close this real quick and then reopen it. For some reason it does not want all of my keyboard commands to exist. Okay. What's going on? What are you doing, Visual Studio? I realize you can't find D. Spacebar works, backspace doesn't, enter doesn't. Does delete? What is going on here? None of those commands work. None of the arrow keys work. Keyboard still works, just not inside of Visual Studio. Okay, this is where you throw in the towel and restart Visual Studio. I have no idea. I have not seen that issue before. That's a new one to me. So let us just fire that solution right back up. We will get going again. That is a bit of a bizarre one. There are occasionally issues with Visual Studio, and it's not always easy for me to tell if that's a Visual Studio issue because I have quite a few extensions installed, and so it's very likely perhaps some of the extensions fighting with each other. And if I was highly motivated and the problem occurred a lot, I'd track down which extension was to blame and get rid of it. But I don't, given that it doesn't happen that much. Huzzah! Okay, so we are implementing remove transaction. So new relay command and on remove transaction. Okay, clear that out. The difference being that you'll notice in our unit tests, and I'm just going to drag this guy to the side here real quick. Dock that guy up, and I'll hide my unit test explorer, is that unlike our first command where we didn't pass a parameter, in this case we're actually expecting to be able to pass a parameter to this command. So in MVVM Lite, if you want to use the command that accepts a parameter, you use the generic version of relay command. So in this case we're expecting it to take a transaction. And so then private void on remove transaction. Something like that. Okay. So what we are going to do is simply take this guy, because we don't really care if a null comes in, because a null shouldn't exist in our list anyway, and if it does, we probably want to remove it. So let's see, transactions dot remove transaction. And we could do some checks and verify, because the remove method actually returns a Boolean indicating if it actually got removed or not. So if we wanted to do something fancy about dealing with that case, but right here I don't think this is a big deal. So let's do that. And then let's actually fire this guy up. Oh, bad. We should have run our unit test first. Once this compiles, we'll kick this off. It's probably still figuring out all of the things. So go ahead and build. Go ahead and launch, and then we'll verify that this may or may not work. So we'll add a couple transactions, highlight the middle one, press delete, and will not work. However, I'm pretty sure I know why. Because in ours, delete. So we hit our command, but you'll notice null is coming in, so it's not actually removing anything. That is a problem. Okay, but more importantly, let's go back and make sure our unit tests are actually working. So we've got a command, and it should verify that when our view behaves appropriately and actually passes the expected data, that it will either add a transaction or remove a transaction. And it works. Okay, and we know that this guy was not working appropriately. So let's take a look. So we have a command here, but the question then comes, where is our command parameter coming from? Because that does not exist. So this conveniently takes a command parameter. So let's see if we can do this. So xname transactions list. So we're just going to give this a name so that we have the ability to reference him. And I can't remember if this works or not. So we're going to try it and see if it does. So we're going to change the source of our binding. So normally bindings always default their source to your data context, unless you set either the source property or the element name. And I think this works. The part that's giving me pause is the fact that this is inside of the list itself. Yeah, we're going to try it and see. I don't know if I get away with this. But ideally, it should then take the selected item from the list and pass it as the parameter to the remove transactions command. And we will see if it works. Didn't blow up immediately, so that's a good sign. I've done so many different ways of deleting from a list. There, that works. So add. Oops, duplicate 3s. Let's take that 3 out. Huzzah! It works. We have a list. We can add transactions to it. We can remove transactions from it. Okay. So this is getting closer, and this ultimately works just fine. So what we probably want to do next is actually change it up so that we can do something more useful with these transactions. Because ultimately, we're wanting to build something where we can keep track of our money flowing in, money flowing out, right? The basic type of a budgeting application. For those people who are interested, I'm pressing Control RG. I always like cleaning up my using statements. You'll also notice on your context menu, remove and sort using statements. It exists right there as well. So I very much like to make those get cleaned up. So on these add transactions, perhaps we don't actually want to go through and display them in this manner, right? We want to, say, display a dialog and let the user type in the description for us, which sounds like a great idea. So in the material design library, there is a dialog host control. So we are going to take advantage of that guy real quick. So yeah, go ahead and include him. Thank you very much. And we're going to put him at the root. So once again, for those people who are interested, if we look here, pull up in my blog list real quick. This is one of the more complicated controls in the material design library. It's probably the one that I get the most questions on. So if anybody is interested in a blog post on how to make good use of it, there it is right there. Okay, so we are going to add a dialog host, and the content that is inside of the dialog host is all of the content that the dialog is going to sit on top of. So in this case, we're going to make our dialog sit on top of everything. Okay, and I think this is probably going to work just fine. So the question then is how to display this dialog. And I think what we might want to do is let's go and just create us a view model. So let's start with a new object. So add transaction view model. Okay, so we'll do that. And let's clean up more using statements. Clean up more using statements. And let's do, let me actually jump back here. So there's a couple ways to actually go through and use the dialog host itself. And if we jump over to the wiki, there is a page on here that walks through some of the more common cases. So dialogs underneath the controls section. The simplest option is we just specify the content for our dialog right in line. The problem with this is I suspect we probably want to use this dialog host for more than just adding transactions. And so I think what we're going to do is actually go down to this dialog host.show option. And I think we'll do that. So what we're going to back out here and do real quick. So in this dialog host, I am going to create some resources. Material. Hey, Minds and Machines. We are going through, this is a simple, I'll call it a learning application. So the repo is empty right now, but it is a basic budgeting style application. Sort of going through some basics of WPF binding, but also pulling in the material design and XAML library because I love it, and trying to make it look pretty and seeing how to build out a a real app doing it, if that answers the question. So if you have questions, comments, I am always happy to deviate from what I think my planned agenda is. So if there are things people want to see or questions about it, feel free to let me know. So we are, aside from botching my XAML all over the place, going through and for reference, that link to the Simply Budget repo is where the code will end up. Nothing is checked in yet. That's basically an empty sample repo where it's going to end up. So in the dialog host resources, we are going to go through and put in a data template. We will make its data type use that add transaction view model. So once again, note the XML namespace. It's the same as what we needed to add for the transaction view model. Oh, cool. Are you actually using material design in your work app, or just something that you're playing around with? So this data template, we are just going to go through and text block, text, make it work like that, right? Using material design in web projects, but not in WPF. Oh, cool. So if you are interested in actually getting sort of a similar look and feel, I run, or I should say I'm the current maintainer of the material design in XAML framework, which is all about bringing the material design spec into the WPF world. So if you are wanting to sort of combine those two things together, take a look at the library. If you've got feedback, there's a Gitter chat room that I try to be pretty active on, or responding to issues. I'm also happy to show examples or go over questions if you've got anything on this stream as well. Okay, so back in our main window view model. So we are going to deviate a little bit. So rather than just blindly always adding a transaction here, we are going to do a dialog host show. So using statement there. So this is material design themes.wpf.dialog host show, and we're going to do a new add transaction view model. And actually, we are going to do, let's pull this out, var dialog view model, create one of those guys, dialog view model, right? Okay. We are going to go through and set this up. So I'll keep that in mind. Currently, I'm happy being up in Washington State, but if I need a change of scenery, I'll certainly post something. So with WPF commands, in general in C# you want to avoid async void methods. They are fraught with peril. The only thing, or the only time where an async void command or an async void method is acceptable is a top-level event handler. So you can imagine in that button click handler from earlier, that if you needed to call an async method, that's an acceptable time to use async void. A similar thing can be said of command objects, because they are effectively event handlers. When things occur, it is acceptable to make them async void. Nothing underneath it, just the top-level execute method. Okay, so the dialog show method is an async method. So this will actually pop the dialog with this view model, and then we are ultimately looking to get back. I think what we'll do is a bool. Bool should add transaction, right? And we will, and it's going to return an object, so we actually have to cast this in. So let's do this. So if is a bool of should add transaction and should add transaction. We'll say this. actually, if you are interested, minds and machines, shameless plug real quick. So I do work for a professional services company. So if you guys are ever needing more assistance or WPF or anything of that nature, we are very much a Microsoft shop with lots of disparate knowledge. So shameless plug for my work. Also, all opinions expressed on this stream are my own and should not reflect on them. And yada yada. Okay, so we will do this. So we're going to take this in here. So right now we're just displaying the dialog. And if the dialog returns back a true, we will go through and we will add the transaction in. Ultimately, we want to pass this value through. So COM experts, I don't know if anyone ever claims to be a COM expert. We have plenty of guys who have done a lot of COM stuff, specifically with like the old Office interop. But yeah, if you're interested, you can either shoot me a message on Gitter or you can just contact us over at Intelitech and feel free to mention my name. If you are interested, I believe I left, let's see here. So I'll just drop a link to my profile in here. I think this includes my email. It doesn't. If you are interested, it is just Kevin and then at Intelitech.com if you want to follow up with any further questions. Okay, so I have already lost my place. So we have a view model. We've got the add transaction command. It's going to create a new dialog view model of type add transaction view model. It'll show the dialog, and if the dialog returns a true, then we'll go through and add something. And ultimately, we're going to be looking to pass this data from the dialog back in. Okay, so inside of our dialog, rather than just straight up text, we should probably include a way to close the dialog because this will be obnoxious if we don't. So once again, I like my grids, so we're going to create a grid, put this guy in here, and our grid will have a couple rows, I think. So we'll do a row definition. So the height 1 star is actually the default value for a row definition. So we can actually even omit that altogether. And then we'll do the same thing where we have height auto. I will say this, there is also a dock panel. So for this type of layout where you want one item to fill and basically a bottom row, a lot of people like the dock panel control as well. To each his own. And then I am going to simply put a button on the bottom. And we will call its content close for now. Eventually we're going to do an OK and a cancel. And its command, we are going to actually do a static reference. The dialog host itself has a couple what are called relay commands in WPF. So in this case, it's going to be the close dialog command. Okay, and then let's see. So we should put it in the bottom row, otherwise it won't move down. I'm going to just shift this guy over, or actually, you know what? Just close you for now since we're doing all view work. So this will push the button over. And then last but not least, so if we just close the dialog like this, it's going to end up returning a null because we haven't told it what parameter to return. So let's expand this guy out, and we will do a, well, let's do it in line first. So command parameter true. Now if you were to go through and do this, command parameter is of type object. And so this is going to return the literal string true, not a true Boolean. So if you actually want to return a Boolean, what you end up doing is something more like this. So Boolean, hey, what is it? System Boolean include. And then you return a true. Okay. This is one of those kind of weird bits of XAML where the obvious conversion that it normally does to the right type falls apart. Again, it's because command parameter is of type object, and we want to be an explicit Boolean, and so it doesn't know to infer the true string into the true Boolean type. So this guy will go through here, and then let's go and we'll just put a breakpoint right here to make sure everything works the way we expect. You can get this guy fired up. Okay, so we hit our add button, and our dialog pops up with the little bit of text of it's working. This is very tight, so I'm just going to instantly throw some margin around it of like 30. I do have the live XAML edit and continue turned on in Visual Studio, which in my mind is the easiest way to work with your UI, because you can make changes right in your XAML and see it working, which is perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and hit close. We hit our breakpoint, and you'll notice the should transaction from the return value is now true, which is great. And it falls into our box, and now we've got our transaction added. And we can still press our delete key, and it goes away. Perfect. Okay, so let's actually build out this dialog and make it a little more useful, because ultimately what we're looking to do is have the user enter a description and get it back from them. So let's start with doing, from a text block, let's do a text box. Right? Oh, and we should stop debugging because it's going to get very confused. And so the text box, there is a hint assist that we can set. So in this case, we're going to go with description. And then let's do hint assist, and we'll say use floating is true. So in material design, this effectively puts the sort of grayed out text over the text box. And then use floating says that when the user starts typing, rather than just omitting that hint text, it actually pushes it up and animates into the corner, which is really nice. So we will then do, let's add, because ultimately what I'm looking to have is a close and an OK button. So we'll do grid, column definitions, column definition, and we'll split the difference even between the two buttons. So this guy here, you're going to be an OK button, and you'll notice I did throw an underscore in front of this. This is for the accelerator keys. So if the user were to hold down Alt and hit O, that would automatically click the OK button. I'm also going to set is default to true, so that if the user presses the enter key, it'll also pick up this button as well. That way you can effectively type, enter, be done. And then we are going to set grid column to be 1. And then we're going to do, let's just grab this whole thing. We'll just copy this up here. Now, so this will be a cancel. This will also close the dialog. Rather than being is default, we'll do is cancel. So this will effectively pick up escape key presses to automatically close the dialog. Now, we could set this parameter to false, but because our code says anything that's not explicitly true is not going to set it, we can just omit this altogether and let null flow through to be our close command. If at some point we want to handle the subtle difference between the user canceling and the user clicking off of the dialog to close it, we could do that. But for now, we are just going to go with this. Sure. So the last thing is this doesn't actually give us what the users typed in for their text. So for that, let's jump back and add transaction view model, right? So here what we want is we are going to once again change this to derive from the MVVM Lite view model base. Okay, and we are going to do public promise I can type. We'll just call it description, right? And once again, I'm going to convert this to a property with a backing field, simply so that I can call that set method for the notify property changed. So ref description value, and we have that. So this lets us do a couple things. So now down here, rather than doing transaction.count, we can actually do dialog view model.description, because this is going to be the same view model that gets displayed into our dialog. In our view, we'll go up here and we will say the text property of this guy will be bound to the description property in our add transaction view model. So as the user types into here, this will update the property, or at least it'll update when the user clicks out of the field, and away we go. Yeah, let's try it. And then we'll take a look and see about unit testing this, because this is somewhat problematic. Oh boy, biggest differences. So the biggest difference is probably coming in the next few months. So there is so right now WPF. Let's see. Clear that. There is .NET 5 that's releasing. I don't know if there's an exact date. I heard Q4 of this year. I also saw somebody reference September. And that's probably going to be one of the biggest development differences, in that rather than targeting the old .NET framework, you can target .NET Core, which instantly provides a bunch of advantages. One, .NET Core has some significant performance improvements over .NET Framework, so you immediately get all of those for free. .NET Core allows side-by-side deployment. So normally with WPF apps, you have to either make the assumption that your end users have the appropriate version of the .NET Framework installed, which is less of an issue with newer Windows 10 stuff, but you either have to deal with the installation of that or assume that the users install it. Whereas .NET Core, you can actually ship the version of your runtime with your app itself, which is awesome. I'm trying to think of what else. Overall, WPF, at least in the last 2 or 3 years, hasn't seen a lot of, I guess, major features or improvements. I think the last big one was like touch and high DPI support, which was sort of just bringing it up to feature parity with like the Universal Windows platform. Over 6 years, though, there were quite a few improvements, just like a lot of, I guess, smoothing over of major problems. Like there used to be WPF airspace issues around even just simple things like embedding the web browser. But all of those have been fixed in the recent version of WPF. Now you still have your airspace issue with like third-party and raw handle host controls, but there's not. But at least the easy cases have all been taken care of. Yeah, so I guess the biggest thing is probably still to come in the next few months, I think would be my complete answer. Okay, so add button, we show a dialog. So this is that description for the text property, and we probably have some formatting to do, because one, my cancel button is sitting underneath my OK button, so let's just fix that first of all. There, my buttons are now side by side. My text box has no margin around it and is being limited to just this first column. So let's fix that too. So grid, column span 2. So that gets it across, and let's get a little bit of, we need some space around this. This is too hard to see. So 0 on the left, 0 on the top, 0 on the right, and maybe 10 on the bottom. And that gets us a little better. We should probably put a header or something on this guy. And maybe a little bit of margin between these guys. So margin, let's see, 0 on the left, 0 on the top, maybe 10 on the right, 0 there. Separate these buttons. And at some point we should probably make them equal width and that kind of thing, and change them up to better match the material design spec. But for now it'll work. Some description, right? Press OK. we've got our item with some description. We go add, we hit cancel, nothing gets added, add, lots of text, cancel, nothing gets added, add some text, and it brings through. Perfect. So aside from the fact that I've broken my unit test, this works great. Okay, so let's see what the problem is here. So in this view model class, we now have this static call. Now, when it comes to unit testing, static calls are usually bad, or at least seen as bad, because they instantly mean a tight coupling between your code and some other method. Now, if the static call is pure in that it doesn't change state, I see no problem with it. This is like all of the link methods are static calls, but they're also pure static calls. And so having that level of coupling isn't a problem. This is problematic because this static call, we want to show a dialog, and ideally in my unit test, I would like to test both sides of this if. Both the user clicking OK, meaning this show method returning true, and this show method returning not true, so false or null. And that's not necessarily an easy thing to handle right here, right? And so the question then comes, how are we going to go about dealing with this? So there are a couple ways I've dealt with this in the past. So I think the first and most obvious way that we're going to go about doing this is we are going to just abstract this away behind an interface. So, and this is going to lead into a much larger discussion probably for next time. So, but we will start here. So do you happen to recommend any recent tutorials or boilerplate for WPF apps that use IOC, async await, etc.? Haven't used XAML since Silverlight days. Let me tell you this, it is much better than then. So let's see. Good tutorials to go through and do it. So the dependency injection is going to be a little bit harder. What you might want to take a look at is the Prism library. I'm not a huge fan of it. However, it does give you a really nice base framework to build on top of. It does add an extra layer of complexity in that you kind of have to understand a little bit of the inner workings, especially when you start dealing with things like pop-up controls, where it gets a little more interesting in that regard. But it does give you a nice setup for being able to do like dependency injection, async and await. The async and await stuff, I don't think, as far as catch-up, this is probably just generic C# stuff. Is it... I'm trying to think of who I saw a good article from. The MSDN blogs have quite a few of async and await stuff as far as learning it, and I think actually async await. I believe the Microsoft Docs. Yeah, that is probably correct. These docs here, I believe, are tied in with some of the try.net stuff, so it's actually an interactive one, if I remember right. Maybe these weren't the ones. I could have sworn I saw buried in here somewhere where it actually does the interactive async and await for testing. The hard part is it's a little difficult to teach multi-threading, especially in this type of environment, because how do you simulate some of those failure cases? I would look through it. There's no, at least from the WPF side, there's not a lot to be aware of. The basic ideas of how to put stuff onto the background thread with task.run, and then in C#. So for example, this await call right here, if this gets invoked on the main GUI thread, the code after the await gets rewritten to also be invoked on that same GUI thread. So by default, if you do nothing, you sort of fall into that pit of success. And so a very, very simplistic example. So private async task my async method. So usually you might end up writing something like this. Include task, please. If you were to do something like int foo gets 0, await task.run. So, in here we end up doing our work on the background thread. So background work. And then down here we are back on GUI thread. So something like this is typically how your WPF code ends up working. There's a little bit of subtlety around this in that the way the execution works. Start on GUI thread. So if this method was not started from the GUI thread, you won't necessarily return to the same thread. So it's only if you await a call and that await occurs from the GUI thread will it go back. The technical details are all around the synchronization context for which ones it knows to go back to or not. Try to think. Yeah, that is exactly correct. Yeah, I'm guessing it sounds like you probably have a little bit more advanced knowledge. If you were looking for sort of a dive through some of the C# syntax, Essential C# is a wonderful book. Full disclosure, my boss is the author, so I'm biased. But there's a 7.0 edition that's out right now that covers everything up through C# 7. There is going to be, well, I shouldn't say there is. There will likely be an 8.0 update when C# 8 gets released as well, with updates for that. So if you're just looking for generic, this doesn't necessarily dive into any given platform. So it's not specific to web or WPF or any of that. It's more about the core language and making sure you understand that. And really, that's the only other thing with the async stuff. Any of the documentation or examples you find will work for WPF. The only thing to be aware of is that that GUI thread has a synchronization context. Your background threads won't have a synchronization context. I think that's it. I'm actually a little disappointed that I can't point you to a good example of some good WPF apps to look at. I don't think I have any that are sufficiently complex enough to actually demonstrate doing it. Hopefully this app, as we build it up, next time spoiler alert, where I was looking to go is doing dependency injection, specifically for abstracting away this dialog host call. Yeah, and unfortunately, I would say if you find any articles from within like the last 3 years, they're probably relevant. Like I said, there hasn't been a lot of foundational changes to WPF in those 3 years, and even the .NET Core stuff isn't going to fundamentally change the API. It's mostly just going to bring in .NET Core support. So better access to the faster, newer APIs, but functionally the code that you write for your WPF app is going to remain the same. So I don't know if there's been anything groundbreaking. Like a lot of this stuff, like there's been a lot of cleanup syntax for like the name of operator. I don't know if you saw that earlier, for raising property changed and that kind of thing, but that's all been more or less syntactic sugar on top of it. So I'm going to pause this right here and just leave myself a to-do. To-do, start here, fix unit test. And I think that's where I'm probably going to pick it up next time, unless there's strong comments from people. For people who are interested in the material design library, just a quick update. I believe the 2.6.0 stuff is probably going to go out soon. Again, I don't necessarily have direct access to push it to NuGet, so I'm a little bit tied waiting. But at the same time, there's been a couple bugs that have come up that it's been probably good that I've delayed a little bit just to make sure that I don't accidentally release something that breaks your app. So I'm trying to avoid having to do a 2.6.1 release with just bug fixes, but that is the nature of the beast, and it may happen no matter what I do. So we'll see how that goes, and hopefully that will be coming soon. So I think, at least for here, I'm going to leave this app right here for this week, and then next Monday we'll come back and take a look at actually cleaning this up, because I do want to get dependency injection tied into this library and start using it in here. So we'll see about getting some of that set up. So Team Explorer, and let's go ahead and commit this. Oh, actually, yeah, Team Explorer will work. Team Explorer will work for now. Oh, we do not have a git ignore file. Okay, that we need to fix immediately. There is a wonderful website whose name escapes me all the time, gitignore.io. That's what it is. If you are ever looking for a default git ignore file and you aren't sure where to get it, this is a great place to start. So we'll just grab this and then save it. So simply budget, and we will put it at the root.gitignore. And that'll get us a reasonable gitignore file. Did it just append.txt to it? Yeah, it did. So thank you for being helpful. Not what I wanted. You must type a file name. Oh, you're going to make me do this the hard way, aren't you? Rename. Oh boy. Oh boy. Rename item. So dot gitignore.txt to gitignore. Way harder than it needed to be. Way harder than it needed to be. Okay, much better. Now we don't have all of those extra files. This looks pretty close to what I would expect. So initial commit of simply budget. Basic app starting. Okay, we're going to get that tied in and synced up. So again, if anybody is actually interested, the repo where this code is going to live is right there. And as soon as this sync actually goes out and it updates, it'll be there shortly. Okay, code should be there, and I think that'll probably be good. I think that's probably going to do it for this app. Unless people have more questions, I am happy to hang out and answer what I can, at least for a little bit. I've still got about a quarter of a thing of Mountain Dew. And my voice isn't dead yet. Let's see what we got going on here. Get that closed, get that closed. There will be an outstanding question as far as which dependency injection framework to include. I'm biased. Like many developers, I've written my own DI framework, and so I might just be biased towards using that. We'll see. We'll see. I'm currently using it in a couple other WPF apps, so I like it. It comes with a bit of magic, and so it's not necessarily a great learning library, but it's a great way to get stuff done quick. And we'll see how that ends up going. Cool. I think with that, I will probably be signing off here. Thank you for coming and hanging out. Appreciate all the questions, minds and machines. Again, if you want to hit me up, you can always find me on the Gitter chat room for material design, or I believe I mentioned my email's Kevin@Intelitech if you want to grab it there. So have a good one. We'll say happy coding, and I will see people again next week.